"Ma'am, I need you to step back from the cockpit door immediately, or I'll have to call security," the flight attendant said firmly, blocking the path of the elegantly dressed black woman who had been calmly walking toward the front of the plane. Dr. Amelia Richardson, one of the world's most respected aviation safety experts, paused mid-stride, her Federal Aviation Administration credentials still clutched in her hand as she processed what had just happened. She had been heading to the cockpit to address a critical safety violation she'd observed during boarding a maintenance issue that could potentially compromise the lives of everyone on board this Boeing 777. But instead of being recognized as the authority she was, she found herself being treated like a threat, questioned and blocked simply because of how she looked rather than who she was or what she represented. The irony wasn't lost on her that in just 2 hours she would be sitting across from airline executives in a boardroom holding the power to ground their entire fleet if safety protocols weren't being followed properly. But right now, in this moment, suspended 35,000 feet above the ground, she was just another black woman being told she didn't belong where she was trying to go. Dr. Amelia Richardson had spent the last 15 years building a reputation that preceded her into every airport terminal, every airline boardroom, and every congressional hearing on aviation safety. As the Federal Aviation Administration's youngest-ever senior safety inspector, she had investigated more than 200 aircraft incidents and had personally developed the safety protocols that were now standard across the industry. Her expertise wasn't just theoretical, it was earned through countless hours crawling through wreckage, analyzing black box recordings, and asking the hard questions that other investigators were sometimes too afraid or too comfortable to ask. She had a particular talent for seeing patterns that others missed, for connecting seemingly unrelated details into comprehensive pictures that revealed the true causes of accidents and near misses. Today's flight from Chicago to Denver was supposed to be routine, just another step in her journey to investigate a series of maintenance irregularities that had been reported across multiple airports. She had chosen to fly commercial rather than using a government aircraft because she wanted to observe the day-to-day operations from a passenger's perspective, to see what the traveling public experienced when they trusted their lives to these machines and the people who maintained them. What she hadn't expected was to witness a perfect example of the very kind of oversight failure that she spent her career trying to prevent. During the boarding process, she had noticed something that made her blood run cold, a maintenance panel on the aircraft's wing that appeared to be improperly secured with what looked like missing bolts that should have been replaced during the previous night's scheduled inspection. As someone who had seen the catastrophic results of seemingly minor maintenance oversights, she knew that even small details like missing bolts could cascade into major structural failures under the right circumstances. Her training and experience told her that this wasn't something that could wait until after landing. It needed to be addressed immediately before the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, where the margin for error became even smaller. She had tried to approach the flight crew through proper channels, first speaking quietly to one of the flight attendants about her concerns and her credentials. But instead of taking her seriously, the crew member had dismissed her observations and had actually seemed annoyed that a passenger was questioning their procedures, as if her expertise and authority meant nothing because she happened to be sitting in seat 12C rather than wearing a uniform. The lead flight attendant, Sarah Mitchell, had been particularly dismissive, barely glancing at Dr. Richardson's federal identification before suggesting that she should let the professionals handle their jobs and return to her seat. The condescending tone and the refusal to even consider that a passenger might have relevant expertise revealed an attitude that Dr. Richardson had encountered too many times throughout her career, the assumption that authority and competence had a particular look, and that she didn't match that expectation. Dr. Richardson understood better than most people the delicate balance of power and responsibility that existed within the aviation industry. She knew that flight crews were trained to maintain order and security, especially in the post-9/11 era, where any unusual behavior could be interpreted as a potential threat. But she also knew that her credentials and her reputation should have been enough to warrant at least a respectful hearing of her concerns, regardless of what she looked like or where she was sitting. The maintenance issue she had identified wasn't just a theoretical concern, it was the kind of oversight that had contributed to several major accidents in recent years. Accidents that had resulted in hundreds of deaths and had led to massive changes in federal safety regulations. She had personally investigated 2 of those crashes and had written reports that had changed how the entire industry approached maintenance protocols and safety inspections. As Dr. Richardson stood in the aircraft aisle, her federal credentials still extended toward Sarah Mitchell, she could feel the weight of every passenger's attention settling on their confrontation. The flight attendant's refusal to even examine the identification was becoming more than just a personal slight. It was beginning to reveal a pattern of behavior that suggested deeper problems with how authority and expertise were recognized and respected within the industry. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to return to your seat immediately." Sarah repeated her voice, carrying the kind of practiced authority that came from years of dealing with what she probably considered difficult passengers. But there was something else in her tone. Now, something that suggested she was more concerned with maintaining her perceived control than with actually listening to what Dr. Richardson was trying to tell her about the potential safety issue. Dr. Richardson took a measured breath, drawing on years of experience dealing with bureaucratic resistance and institutional blind spots. "Sarah," she said, reading the flight attendant's name tag and keeping her voice calm but firm. "I understand that you have procedures to follow, but I'm trying to report a maintenance concern that could affect the safety of everyone on this aircraft, and my credentials show that I have the federal authority to ground this plane if necessary." The words hung in the air between them, creating a moment of tension that seemed to ripple through the surrounding passengers who were beginning to pay closer attention to the exchange. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flicker of uncertainty as she processed what Dr. Richardson had said. But instead of taking the time to actually examine the credentials or listen to the safety concern, she seemed to double down on her original assumption. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing," Sarah said, her voice rising just enough to carry to the passengers in nearby rows. "But federal inspectors don't fly commercial airlines to conduct surprise inspections, and they certainly don't try to talk their way into secured areas by claiming to be someone they're not. So I'm going to need you to stop this disruption and return to your assigned seat before I have to involve the air marshal." The accusation that she was somehow impersonating a federal official hit Dr. Richardson like a physical blow, not just because it was so completely wrong, but because it revealed how quickly legitimate authority could be dismissed and discredited when it didn't match someone's preconceived expectations. She had spent years earning the right to carry those credentials, years studying and training and proving herself in a field where mistakes could cost lives, and now she was being treated like some kind of con artist, trying to talk her way into areas where she didn't belong. "I'm not trying to gain unauthorized access to anything," Dr. Richardson replied, her professional training helping her maintain composure even as she felt her frustration building. "I'm trying to report a maintenance issue that I observed during boarding missing bolts on a wing panel, and I'm trying to do it through proper channels because that's exactly what federal safety inspectors are supposed to do when we identify potential hazards." But Sarah Mitchell seemed determined not to listen. Perhaps because acknowledging the legitimacy of Dr. Richardson's concerns would mean admitting that she had made a mistake in her initial assessment, or perhaps because the idea that a black woman could hold such significant federal authority simply didn't fit into her understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "Security needs to be called," Sarah announced loudly enough for passengers several rows away to hear clearly, pulling out her communication device with theatrical emphasis that seemed designed to demonstrate her authority rather than to actually address any legitimate safety concerns. "We have a passenger who is refusing to comply with crew instructions and is making false claims about being a federal official." The announcement sent a ripple of alarm through the cabin as passengers began turning in their seats to get a better look at the situation. Some pulling out their phones to record what was happening, others whispering among themselves about what they were witnessing. Dr. Richardson could see the situation escalating in exactly the way she had hoped to avoid. but she also knew that backing down now wouldn't solve the maintenance issue that had started this entire confrontation. In the midst of the growing commotion, a voice cut through the chaos with quiet authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone within earshot. "Excuse me," said Captain Robert Hayes as he emerged from the cockpit, his uniform and bearing making it clear that he was the aircraft's pilot in command. "But did someone just say that, Doctor?" Richardson was on board this flight. The question seemed to freeze everyone in place, creating a moment of suspended silence as Sarah Mitchell processed the implication that the captain not only recognized Dr. Richardson's name, but seemed to know exactly who she was. Dr. Richardson felt a mixture of relief and vindication as she realized that at least one member of the flight crew understood the significance of her presence and her credentials. "Because if Dr. Amelia Richardson from the Federal Aviation Administration is on my aircraft," Captain Hayes continued, his tone carrying the weight of someone who clearly understood the gravity of the situation, "then I need to speak with her immediately about any safety concerns she might have identified, since her recommendations have literally saved thousands of lives over the past decade, and ignoring her input would be both professionally irresponsible and potentially catastrophic." The transformation in the cabin atmosphere was immediate and dramatic as Captain Hayes's words sank in, creating a ripple effect of realization that spread through the passengers and crew members who had been witnessing the confrontation. Sarah Mitchell's face went through a series of expressions as she processed what the captain had just revealed. Confusion, recognition, and then a dawning horror as she began to understand the magnitude of her mistake in dismissing and challenging someone of Dr. Richardson's stature and authority. Dr. Richardson stepped forward, extending her credentials toward Captain Hayes, who examined them with the careful attention that Sarah Mitchell had refused to give them just moments earlier. "Captain, I appreciate your recognition of my position," she said, her voice carrying the professional authority that came from years of experience in high-stakes situations, "and I need to discuss with you a maintenance concern I observed during boarding that could potentially affect the structural integrity of your aircraft." The captain's expression grew serious as he listened, nodding for her to continue while Sarah Mitchell stood frozen nearby, apparently realizing that her assumptions and behavior had not only been wrong, but had potentially interfered with a legitimate federal safety inspection. "I noticed what appears to be missing or improperly secured bolts on a wing panel," Dr. Richardson continued, "and based on my experience investigating similar maintenance oversights, this could represent a significant safety hazard that needs immediate attention." Captain Hayes immediately understood the implications of what she was telling him, his training and experience allowing him to recognize that Dr. Richardson's concerns weren't something that could be dismissed or postponed until a more convenient time. "Dr. Richardson, I want you to know that I have the highest respect for your work and your expertise," he said, his voice carrying genuine appreciation and professionalism, "and I would very much like you to accompany me to examine the area you're concerned about so that we can determine the appropriate course of action." The invitation to inspect the aircraft alongside the captain represented exactly the kind of collaboration that should have happened from the beginning, the kind of professional interaction that Dr. Richardson had been trying to initiate before she had been dismissed and challenged by crew members who had made assumptions based on her appearance rather than her qualifications. As they prepared to move toward the area where she had observed the maintenance issue, the contrast between Captain Hayes's respectful professionalism and Sarah Mitchell's defensive dismissiveness became even more stark and obvious. Sarah Mitchell finally found her voice, apparently feeling the need to defend her earlier actions, even as it became increasingly clear that those actions had been based on completely incorrect assumptions. Captain Y was just following standard security protocols. She said, her voice carrying a defensive tone that suggested she was trying to justify behavior that was becoming more embarrassing. "With each passing moment, passengers aren't supposed to make unauthorized approaches to the cockpit area, and I had no way of knowing that her credentials were legitimate." The excuse revealed the exact problem that Dr. Richardson had encountered throughout her career the assumption that legitimate authority had a particular appearance and that credentials and expertise could be dismissed if they didn't match those preconceived expectations. Captain Hayes turned to address Sarah Mitchell directly, his expression showing disappointment rather than anger as he processed what had happened during his absence from the main cabin. Sarah Dr. Richardson's identification clearly shows her federal authority and her position with the FAA. He said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood both the professional and safety implications of what had occurred, and more importantly, she was trying to report a potential safety concern through proper channels, which is exactly what we should want any qualified professional to do if they identify something that could affect passenger safety. The captain's response highlighted not just the procedural mistakes that had been made, but the broader implications of dismissing expertise and authority based on superficial judgments rather than actual qualifications and credentials. As Dr. Richardson prepared to examine the maintenance issue with Captain Hayes, she could see other passengers beginning to understand what had really happened and why the confrontation had escalated the way it had. A businessman in seat 14A had been recording portions of the interaction on his phone, and he now spoke up with obvious indignation at what he had witnessed. That flight attendant completely dismissed her from the beginning, he said, his voice carrying to the surrounding passengers. She wouldn't even look at her credentials. And now we find out she's some kind of federal aviation expert who was trying to report a safety problem that could affect all of us. The passenger's observation captured exactly what many others had been thinking as they watched the situation unfold, and it highlighted the dangerous consequences of allowing bias and assumptions to interfere with legitimate safety protocols and professional communications. Dr. Richardson could see that the incident was becoming more than just a personal confrontation. It was becoming a teaching moment about the importance of listening to expertise regardless of where it came from or how it was packaged. Another passenger, a woman traveling with 2 young children, expressed her concern more directly. "If there's really a safety problem with this plane," she said, her voice tight with worry, "then I want to know what's being done about it, and I want to know why it took so long for the crew to take it seriously when someone with the qualifications to identify these things was trying to help us." Her question highlighted the fundamental issue at the heart of the entire situation, that passenger safety should always take precedence over hierarchical assumptions or procedural defensiveness, and that qualified expertise should be welcomed and respected regardless of its source. As Captain Hayes and Dr. Richardson prepared to examine the wing panel together, the incident had already evolved from a simple misunderstanding into a powerful demonstration of how bias and assumption could interfere with the very safety systems that were designed to protect everyone on board. The irony was that Dr. Richardson's presence on the flight, rather than being the disruption that Sarah Mitchell had tried to frame it as, could potentially save the lives of everyone on board if her observations about the maintenance issue proved to be as serious as her experience suggested they might be. As Dr. Richardson and Captain Hayes made their way toward the aircraft's exit to examine the wing panel, she had identified the passenger who had been recording the confrontation on his phone, suddenly looked up from his device with an expression of shock and recognition. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin as other passengers turned to listen. "I just looked up. Dr. Amelia Richardson on my phone, and she's the person who investigated that major crash in Denver 3 years ago, the one that led to all those new safety regulations." The revelation sent a new wave of awareness through the cabin as passengers began to understand, not just that Dr. Richardson was a federal official, but that she was someone whose work had directly impacted the safety of commercial aviation in ways that affected every person who had ever stepped onto an airplane. The businessman continued reading from his phone, his voice growing more amazed with each detail he discovered about her background and accomplishments. "She's investigated over 200 aircraft incidents." He continued scrolling through the information on his screen, while other passengers leaned in to listen, and she developed the maintenance protocols that are now used across the entire industry to prevent exactly the kind of problems she was trying to report to the crew. And according to this article, her investigations and recommendations have been credited with preventing thousands of potential accidents. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen in the aisle, the full weight of her mistake becoming increasingly clear as passengers around her began to understand that she had not only dismissed a federal official, but had actually interfered with someone whose expertise and authority were specifically designed to protect the safety of everyone on board the aircraft. The recognition that Dr. Richardson was not just any government inspector, but one of the most respected and accomplished safety experts in the country, transformed what had seemed like a routine passenger dispute into something much more serious and troubling. Another passenger, a woman who had been quietly observing the entire interaction, now spoke up with obvious disbelief at what she had witnessed. "So you're telling me," she said, addressing Sarah Mitchell directly, "that when one of the country's top aviation safety experts tried to report a potential problem with this airplane, you not only refused to listen to her, but you actually accused her of impersonating a federal official and threatened to have her arrested?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, forcing everyone present to confront the absurdity and danger of what had occurred when legitimate expertise had been dismissed and challenged based on assumptions that had nothing to do with qualifications or authority. Dr. Richardson, overhearing the conversation as she prepared to follow Captain Hayes, turned back to address the passengers who were now beginning to understand the full implications of what they had witnessed. "I want everyone to understand," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of dealing with crisis situations, "that what happened here isn't just about me or my credentials. It's about the broader question of how we recognize and respect expertise when it comes to safety issues that affect all of us. And it's about making sure that legitimate concerns are heard and addressed regardless of who is raising them or how they might look." Captain Hayes, who had been listening to the passenger discussions while reviewing Dr. Richardson's credentials more thoroughly, now addressed the cabin with the kind of announcement that passengers rarely heard from flight crews. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying over the aircraft's public address system, "I want to personally apologize for the way Dr. Richardson was treated by members of my crew, and I want you to know that we are taking her safety concerns very seriously and will be conducting a thorough inspection before this aircraft moves another inch." The announcement represented more than just an apology. It was an acknowledgement that the dismissive treatment Dr. Richardson had received was not only unprofessional, but potentially dangerous, since it had interfered with the very safety oversight systems that were designed to protect passengers from exactly the kind of maintenance issues she had been trying to report. As the full scope of the situation became clear to everyone in the cabin, Sarah Mitchell found herself facing not just professional embarrassment, but the realization that her bias and assumptions had potentially put everyone's safety at risk by preventing a qualified expert from doing her job effectively. Dr. Richardson and Captain Hayes returned to the cabin after their inspection of the wing panel, and the gravity of their expressions immediately told passengers that the maintenance issue was even more serious than anyone had initially realized. Captain Hayes's face was pale as he activated the aircraft's public address system, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just discovered that they were potentially moments away from a catastrophic situation that could have affected every person on board. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he announced, his professional training helping him maintain composure despite the severity of what he had just witnessed. After conducting a thorough inspection with Dr. Richardson, we have identified a maintenance issue that requires immediate attention, and we will be returning to the gate so that our maintenance crew can address this problem before we attempt to depart. The announcement sent a ripple of concern through the cabin, but also a sense of relief as passengers realized that Dr. Richardson's expertise had potentially saved their lives by identifying a problem that might not have been discovered until it was too late to prevent a serious accident. As the aircraft began its taxi back to the terminal, Captain Hayes turned to address Dr. Richardson directly, his voice carrying genuine gratitude and professional respect. "Dr. Richardson, I want to personally thank you for your diligence in identifying this issue." he said, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly, "and I want to apologize again for the way you were initially treated when you tried to bring this safety concern to our attention through proper channels, because your persistence in pursuing this matter despite the obstacles you encountered has quite literally saved lives today." The captain's acknowledgement created a moment of profound silence in the cabin as passengers processed the full implications of what had occurred, understanding that what had initially appeared to be a routine dispute about authority and credentials had actually been a life-and-death situation where expertise and persistence had triumphed over assumption and dismissiveness. Sarah Mitchell, who had been standing quietly nearby during the inspection, now stepped forward with an expression that showed the full weight of her realization about what her behavior had nearly caused. "Dr. Richardson," she said, her voice shaking with emotion as she struggled to find words adequate to address the magnitude of her mistake. "I owe you, and every passenger on this aircraft, an apology that goes far beyond anything I could possibly say, because my refusal to listen to your concerns and my dismissal of your expertise could have resulted in a tragedy that would have affected dozens of families, and I have no excuse for letting my assumptions override my professional responsibilities." The apology represented more than just personal remorse. It was an acknowledgement that bias and preconceived notions about authority and expertise could have catastrophic consequences when they interfered with legitimate safety protocols and professional communications. Dr. Richardson listened to Sarah's words with the kind of grace and professionalism that had characterized her entire career, understanding that this moment represented an opportunity for education and growth, rather than simply punishment or blame. "Sarah, I appreciate your apology," Dr. Richardson replied, her voice carrying both firmness and compassion, as she addressed not just the flight attendant, but the broader issues that had been revealed by their confrontation. "But what's important now is that we all learn from this experience and understand how dangerous it can be when we allow assumptions about who has authority and expertise to override our commitment to safety and our willingness to listen to legitimate concerns." As the aircraft continued its slow progress back to the terminal, other passengers began to speak up about what they had witnessed, their voices carrying a mixture of anger, relief, and determination to ensure that similar incidents wouldn't happen in the future. The businessman who had been recording portions of the confrontation now addressed Sarah Mitchell directly, his tone reflecting the seriousness of what had nearly occurred because of her dismissive behavior. "I recorded most of what happened here today," he said, holding up his phone for emphasis. "And I think people need to understand how close we came to disaster because a qualified expert was dismissed and challenged instead of being listened to when she tried to report a safety problem. And I think the airline industry needs to take a hard look at how bias and assumption can interfere with the very systems that are designed to protect passenger safety." His statement highlighted the broader implications of the incident, suggesting that what had occurred wasn't just an isolated mistake, but potentially part of a pattern of behavior that could affect safety and security across the entire aviation industry. Another passenger, woman who had been traveling with her elderly mother, now voiced her own concerns about the systemic issues that the confrontation had revealed. "What worries me," she said, her voice carrying to passengers throughout the surrounding area, "is how quickly legitimate authority and expertise were dismissed, and how many other safety concerns might be ignored or overlooked because they come from people who don't match someone's expectations about what authority is supposed to look like. And I think that's a problem that goes far beyond just this one flight or this one crew member." Dr. Richardson nodded in response to the passenger's observation, recognizing that the woman had identified exactly the broader issue that needed to be addressed if the aviation industry was going to learn from this incident and prevent similar situations in the future. "You're absolutely right to be concerned about that," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying these exact types of systemic problems. "And that's why it's so important that we use this experience as an opportunity to examine how we recognize and respond to expertise, especially when it comes to safety issues that affect everyone." As the aircraft finally reached the gate, and passengers began to understand that they would be safe because Dr. Richardson's concerns had been taken seriously, the incident had already evolved from a simple misunderstanding into a powerful demonstration of how expertise and persistence could overcome bias and assumption when lives were at stake. Captain Hayes made one final announcement as the maintenance crew prepared to board the aircraft and address the safety issue that Dr. Richardson had identified. "I want everyone to understand," he said, his voice carrying over the public address system, with clear conviction and professional authority, that Dr. Richardson's actions today represent exactly the kind of professional excellence and dedication to safety that we should expect from everyone involved in the aviation industry, and her persistence in pursuing this matter despite initial resistance has demonstrated why we need to listen carefully to expertise, regardless of where it comes from or how it might challenge our preconceived notions about authority. The captain's final statement served as both a tribute to Dr. Richardson's professionalism and a challenge to everyone present to examine their own assumptions about expertise, authority, and the importance of maintaining open channels of communication when safety issues were at stake. 6 months after the incident that had nearly resulted in a catastrophic mechanical failure, Dr. Amelia Richardson stood before a packed congressional hearing room addressing lawmakers and airline industry representatives about the sweeping changes that had emerged from that single confrontation on Flight 447. The maintenance issue she had identified had been even more serious than initially suspected. The missing bolts were part of a pattern of oversight failures that had affected multiple aircraft across several airlines, representing a potential disaster that could have claimed hundreds of lives if it hadn't been caught in time. The events of that day revealed critical gaps, not just in our maintenance procedures, but in our willingness to recognize and respond to expertise when it challenges our expectations or disrupts our assumptions. Dr. Richardson testified, her voice carrying to every corner of the hearing room where representatives from major airlines, federal officials, and safety advocates had gathered to examine the broader implications of the incident. The congressman chairing the hearing, Representative Michael Torres, leaned forward as he addressed the airline executives who were present to answer questions about the policy changes that had been implemented since the Flight 447 incident. "Can you explain to this committee," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood the life and death implications of the issues being discussed, "what specific steps your industry has taken to ensure that qualified safety experts are heard and respected regardless of their appearance or the circumstances under which they raise concerns?" The response came from Jennifer Walsh, the newly appointed Vice President of Safety Operations for the airline consortium that had been formed to address the systemic issues revealed by Dr. Richardson's experience. "Congressman Torres, we have implemented comprehensive training programs that emphasize the recognition and validation of federal credentials and professional expertise," she said, her voice reflecting the seriousness with which the industry was now approaching these concerns. "And we have established clear protocols for crew members to follow when any passenger identifies themselves as having relevant safety expertise." But the changes went far beyond simple procedural adjustments. They represented a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry approached questions of authority, expertise, and the critical importance of maintaining open communication channels when passenger safety was at stake. Sarah Mitchell, who had requested to testify at the hearing despite the personal and professional consequences she had faced since the incident, now stood to address the committee about her own transformation and the lessons she had learned from her mistakes. "Representatives, I want to acknowledge that my actions on Flight 447 nearly contributed to a tragedy that could have affected dozens of families," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of her testimony. "And I want to explain how the bias awareness training that followed this incident has helped me understand how dangerous it can be when we allow assumptions to override our professional responsibilities and our commitment to passenger safety." Her testimony was particularly powerful because it demonstrated that individual change was possible when people were willing to confront their own biases and learn from their mistakes rather than simply defending their original actions or denying that problems existed. The training program she referenced had become a model for the entire industry, focusing not just on recognizing credentials and following procedures, but on examining the unconscious assumptions that could interfere with effective safety communications. Dr. Richardson, responding to questions from committee members about the broader implications of her experience, emphasized that the goal of the reforms wasn't to punish individuals who had made mistakes, but to create systems that would prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. The most important outcome of this entire experience, she said, has been the recognition that expertise and authority come in many different forms, and that our safety depends on our willingness to listen carefully to qualified concerns, regardless of who is raising them or how they might challenge our expectations. The hearing concluded with the announcement of the Amelia Richardson Aviation Safety Communication Act legislation that would require regular bias awareness training for all airline personnel and establish clear federal guidelines for recognizing and responding to safety expertise. But perhaps the most significant change had been in the industry's culture itself, a new understanding that diversity and inclusion weren't just matters of fairness and equality, but essential components of effective safety management. Captain Hayes, who had also been invited to testify about his experience during the Flight 447 incident, offered his perspective on how the changes had affected day-to-day operations across the industry. The new protocols have created an environment where crew members are encouraged to welcome input from qualified passengers rather than viewing it as a challenge to their authority, he said. And that cultural shift has already resulted in the identification and prevention of several potential safety issues that might have been missed under the old approaches. As Dr. Richardson left the hearing room surrounded by safety advocates and congressional staff members who wanted to discuss the continuing implementation of the reforms, she reflected on how a single moment of bias and assumption had ultimately led to transformative changes that would protect countless passengers for years to come. The incident had been painful and frustrating in the moment, but it had also created an opportunity for the entire aviation industry to examine and improve its approach to safety expertise and the critical importance of listening to qualified concerns regardless of their source. Sarah Mitchell, walking a few steps behind, approached Dr. Richardson as they reached the corridor outside the hearing room. "Dr. Richardson," she said, extending her hand with an expression that combined professional respect with personal gratitude. "I wanted to thank you again for your patience and grace throughout this entire process, and for helping me understand how I can do better in the future." The handshake between them represented more than just personal reconciliation. It symbolized the possibility for growth and positive change when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and assumption, and when institutions were committed to learning from their mistakes, rather than simply defending their existing practices as Dr. Richardson boarded her next flight 3 months later. She noticed something that would have been impossible before the Flight 447 incident crew members, who not only recognized her credentials immediately, but actively welcomed her expertise and asked if she had any observations or concerns about the aircraft or its operations. The transformation wasn't just procedural, it was cultural, reflecting a new understanding that safety depended on collaboration rather than hierarchy. The young flight attendant who greeted her, Marcus Williams, had been part of the new generation of crew members trained under the updated protocols that emphasized recognition of expertise and the importance of maintaining open communication channels with qualified passengers. "Dr. Richardson, it's an honor to have you aboard today," he said with genuine respect and professionalism. "And please don't hesitate to let us know if you notice anything that might require our attention during the flight." His words represented exactly the kind of collaborative approach that the industry had embraced since the incident, an understanding that passenger safety was enhanced rather than threatened when qualified experts were welcomed and respected regardless of their appearance or the circumstances under which they offered their input. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, carrying passengers who could travel with greater confidence, knowing that the systems designed to protect them had been strengthened by hard-won lessons about expertise bias and the critical importance of listening carefully when qualified voices raised concerns about their safety. If this story resonated with you and made you think about the importance of recognizing expertise in all its forms, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, justice, and the power of positive change. Share your thoughts in the comments about times when you've seen bias overcome by understanding, and let us know where you're watching from around the world.